Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us here today on the webinar. Today, the chair of the Appraiser Qualifications Board, Mark Lewis, will be discussing the proposed general interpretation of the real property appraiser qualifications criteria. Mark, as always, would you like to introduce yourself real quick, and then I'll do the same?
Well, thank you, Lisa. I'm glad to be here and glad for you folks who are joining in with us. My name is Mark Lewis, and I am the chair of the Appraiser Qualifications Board. I'm a general certified appraiser based out of Lufkin, Texas, and I run a small appraisal firm that specializes in residential and primarily agricultural appraisals. So I'm glad to be here.
Thanks, Mark. And I'm Lisa Damaris, the Vice President of Appraisal Issues here at the Appraisal Foundation. My main role is to provide support, research, and expertise to the Appraisal Qualifications Board and the Appraiser Standards Board. Okay, so before we begin, I'm going to go through a real quick few housekeeping items I always run through. Just so you know, we are recording the webinar, and you will see the recording post to our website on our YouTube channel in less than about 24 hours. Time permitting, we always answer questions at the end. I'm sure we'll have time today. To ask a question, you move your mouse to the bottom of the screen. A menu will appear, and one of those options shows the chat feature. I'm sure you're all getting used to this by now. So just open up that chat box. I recommend you keeping it open. You can post the question in there, or later on, we'll also be having an option where you can actually virtually raise your hand and then personally ask your question. At the conclusion of the webinar, we will have a very quick and brief survey that will pop up, and it just takes less than a minute to fill out. It always helps us to improve our webinars. Agenda. So for our agenda today, as I mentioned, we are going to be discussing sections of the first exposure draft of a proposed general interpretation of the criteria. That is a mouthful. Unlike other exposure drafts of proposed changes to the criteria, this exposure draft is just on an interpretation of the criteria. So interpretations are essential. They're essential to properly understand the criteria, and therefore they are binding on the users of the criteria. Interpretations are added to the criteria after they have been adopted by the AQB. The interpretations are listed in subject matter order, so they follow the applicable criteria. The criteria currently only has one interpretation in it, and it is on page 6. If the second interpretation is adopted, it will appear in that same section. Now, this particular interpretation is relatively succinct, and it consists of only one section. So in all likelihood, this webinar is going to be a lot shorter than some of our other ones are. Today, Mark is going to explain the basic rationale of the interpretation. And if you want more detail, you can always open up a copy of the draft. It is on page 4 under the written rationale there. As previously stated, Mark will be answering a few questions. We realize, however, that we may not be able to answer all of your questions today. So if you're able, type your questions into the chat box. And if we're not able to cover them in the webinar, we can always get back to you on an email. And if the questions that we receive in a chat box have kind of a common theme and the answers are something that we think a lot of people would want to hear, we actually do go ahead and type up Q&As and send those out to everybody. So again, use that chat box as much as you can. If you do have a comment, we want to highlight that we have a new comment format for you. If you have already opened up and viewed the exposure draft that we're discussing today, you might have noticed that in addition to the traditional way that we've been receiving comments in the past, which has been via email, that we have added alternative ways for you to get your comments to us. You can now, once you open up that exposure draft, you can click on a link, and it gives you the ability to attach a Word or a PDF document, or just to type your comments directly into the box. And one thing I want to point out to you is that you are able to provide your name with your comments, or you can always opt to provide your comments anonymously. If you provide them anonymously, they truly are anonymous and we don't have any idea of where they came from. We can't track them in any way. So do feel free to use whatever option works best for you. Or if you have any informal comments, you can always email me and we can set up a time to briefly chat on the phone. So as we are discussing this proposed interpretation, what I want to do is to give you a question to think about while you are listening. And hopefully, as things come to you, you can provide your thoughts in the chat box. What we do is we capture and store all of the comments in the chat box, and we organize them, and we provide them directly to every member of the AQB to read. So you using the comment box or the chat box is an excellent way to get your informal feedback directly to the AQB. So here you see on the screen is the question we'd kind of like you to think about today. It's, what would you like the board to know about your experience verification process? So in other words, just anything that comes to mind, what tasks do you perform? What do your regulations say about your process? What are your goals in the verification process? I mean, really anything that comes to mind. The more that the AQB understands about your world and the better we understand how it works, the better. Okay, so after I got done explaining all that, now we're about ready to begin here. Mark, you want to get into it for us? Can you please tell everybody a bit about the background of this first exposure draft?
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you, Lisa. Kind of the nutshell background is that the AQB has recently learned of circumstances in some states where state appraiser regulatory agencies have approved applicants for real estate licensure or certification to take the national exam before completing their experience verification process. Now, these jurisdictions, as we understand, have accepted self-verifying affidavits or attestations from these applicants relating to their experience as sufficient information for them to be released to take their national exam. And then after the applicant passes the exam, then the state would start or complete the experience verification process. But the only issue is that this practice is inconsistent with the criteria. The AQB is proposing this interpretation to ensure the meaning of the criteria cannot be misunderstood or misinterpreted, and to kind of emphasize this contradiction. So with that, kind of let me give you a little historical background that I hopefully won't take too long with. But this began this process of experience and education before examination began in 2011 with the AQB. There were 5 exposure drafts at that time, which contained this this element of change, and it wasn't adopted or made effective until January the 1st of 2015. Again, that was after 5 exposure drafts with much discussion and feedback. But the final 5th and final exposure draft that came out had the following rationale that were added. And I won't necessarily read the whole thing here, but it's on your screen. And this is an excerpt from the 5th and final exposure draft that was actually adopted by the AQB back in 2011 and made effective in January of 2015. But the kind of nutshell of this was that the AQB discovered that applicants were being more successful with the national exam when their education and their experience had been completed. And so this made a lot of sense, because the exam is a practice-based exam. And so having that experience combined with the education made folks more successful. And so the AQB at that time put in the requirement that education and experience was a prerequisite for examination. Now, the specific wording of these criteria provisions was that was, and it remains fairly clear and determinative, that a state agency's verification of an applicant's education and experience is a prerequisite to taking the national exam. Now, I'm not sure if it's necessary to go through the definition of a prerequisite, but from Merriam's dictionary, it says something that is necessary to an end or to the carrying out of a function. So, it's AQB's opinion that prerequisite means exactly what it says. Now, you need to understand that Title 11 leaves the determination of completeness and delegates that to the state agencies. But
Mark, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead. No, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Lisa.
I was just going to ask you a question there. So it appears from what you're saying that the AQB's intent has always been clear. So why do we need to even issue a general interpretation?
Well, notwithstanding the criteria's plain meaning, it's because that AQB has discovered that some agencies are reportedly approving applicants to take the national exam before completing the experience verification process. Now, in lieu of completing the process, these jurisdictions, as we understand, have allowed applicants to sit for their national exam based on those written affidavits or attestation or some kind of similar representation. These jurisdictions would then initiate or complete their experience verification review only after that applicant took and passed the exam. So in AQB's opinion, this may actually adversely affect applicants. First of all, as discussed above, allowing applicants to take the exam without education and experience being fully vetted reduces the likelihood they'll pass the exam. But even, I guess, a little more troubling to AQB recently is that we have discovered that some applicants who actually passed the national exam reportedly have not been granted their appraisal credential or were offered a credential lower than the exam level passed. For example, we've heard of folks who have passed the certified residential exam, and then the state agencies reviewed or completed their verification process of the experience and offered that applicant a licensed residential credential. And that's kind of troubling. The third is this practice could require an applicant to retake the national exam if the state's experience verification process were to take longer than 24 months from the date that the applicant passed the exam. And that's part of the criteria also. Therefore, based on all this, the AQB is proposing this general certification or general interpretation rather, to ensure that state agencies fully understand that they must complete the education and the experience validation process before approving an applicant to sit for the national exam.
That's a great explanation. Can we see the general interpretation that the AQB is issuing?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa, for putting that up on the screen. It's short, so I normally don't like to read things, but I think we can probably read this one. But the interpretation simply says, with respect to the prerequisites needed before an applicant takes the national licensing and certification exam, as referenced in the various sections 2B above, applicants must have all experience in education completely verified by the appropriate state appraiser regulatory agency prior to taking the national exam. And then we add a little statement at the end that says applicants cannot self-verify experience.
Great. Thanks for reading that, Mark. I know that this is, like I said before, this is a very short discussion. So we have time for questions now. I know we're only 15 minutes in, but we just needed to get everything out on the table. If you all have any questions, you can either put that in the chat box and I can attempt to read those to Mark, or if you'd like to speak, just raise your digital hand. To raise your hand, you click on the participants button on the Zoom menu, click raise your hand. Aida will be handling those. So, and just bear with us while we go back and forth because Aida usually does that and I kind of try and read the chat box at the same time. So I'm going to ask Aida if you want to check that and see if there are any hands raised, and then I will go ahead and look at the chat box.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Lisa. So actually we do have one question, one hand raised. I see Glenn Kangas. Glenn, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself and you should see a little pop-up on your screen.
Okay.
There you go.
I got that. Yeah, I was just, I don't know, when I was thinking about this, I mean, I understand what everybody's saying, but it just seems like, micro control from afar rather than letting the states kind of decide what they want to do. And it seems like if somebody is able to pass the test early, that's fine. So why should they be penalized? And if somebody doesn't pass the test because they took it too early, I mean, it's obviously better if you wait until you finish before you take the test. But I just think it's better to have, let the states decide how they want to handle that instead of trying to, from, Washington, D.C. or whatever. I don't even know where you guys are. Try to micromanage every little tiny detail. I just think it's overreach and unnecessary. I think we're spending a lot of time worrying about little things like this that aren't relevant when we should be focusing on many other more important things in the industry than, the language and, and wording on how states approve and offer licenses and stuff like that.
Well, Glenn, thanks for the comment. I appreciate it, but with all due respect to your comment, it's AQB's responsibility to put out the minimum requirements. Again, this has been around since effective since 2015, and what the goal is for us to have a process that effectively moves folks through the system to be fair to both the applicant and also to the public trust. And the process is a sequential process of education and experience, and then examination. The examination from AQB's point of view is the capstone. If you can pass that examination and you have met the prerequisites for it, then you should be issued a license or certification without any other undue delay, assuming that there's no issue with maybe a background or some other type of administrative function there. But as far as qualifications go, if you've passed the exam, you've met the qualifications, and without delay, you should be issued a license or certification.
Great. Thank you, Mark. We don't have any questions here. We just have two comments. I'll just read them because people might find them interesting. One person had noted that since this is just an interpretation, states who are currently not following the goal of the AQB should not wait until this is adopted to alter their practices or update their rules. Another comment we have is from a trainee who has experienced this and said it has been devastating. They have been trying to celebrate since passing the exam back in February, but have still not been able to get their license. And here we go. Here's a question mark. Where should appraisers report a state violation of AQB requirements? I'm not sure we can answer that.
Yeah, the AQB is not in the enforcement arena. That would fall under the ASC, the subcommittee's purview. AQB is responsible for issuing the minimum criteria, and ASC is responsible for enforcing that criteria in a consistent manner across the states.
Great. I don't see any other questions. Aida, what do you
Mhm.
have?
Yes, I have one hand raised, and I think it's from Hank. Okay, Hank, you should be able to see a pop-up screen.
Think so. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I just wanted to maybe comment on
Yes, go ahead, Hank.
the question on the comment about, I guess, overreach. And, I think, states are free to adopt whatever rules they want. You all have set the minimum. But by the same token, I do work for a state and I'm in a compliance department. We get a lot of complaints. And I think what appraisers need to understand is that when a complaint comes in, if it's found that they were at fault at something, that could potentially affect their ability to practice, not as far as we're concerned. Well, I mean, if it's severe enough, we might take action. But most banks or a lot of banks and AMCs verify any prior disciplinary action with a board before they bring an appraiser onto a panel. So, we can quickly allow people to get their license, but I think long-term, they're not realizing that they could just as quick lose the ability to maybe maximize their license because of some action that happened because they didn't have quite the training they should have had when they were licensed, just for what that's worth.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Hank. I would, just offer a little bit of commentary here that, when a applicant presents their evidence of completion of experience in education for review and verification at the jurisdictional level, that's not a complaint. It's a little concerning to me that sometimes these applicants are really put through the ringer as to pulling work files and really examining those appraisals that are submitted at the state level for review that really, really, again, as I've said for years, that you're really not reviewing the trainees' work, you're reviewing the supervisor's work. And so, I would just exercise caution here. As Hank has stated, the AQB offers minimum criteria. The states can exceed that criteria. But at the minimum, there is information in the criteria which gives what is the minimum level of documentation that's required as evidence of completion of experience. And if you read that, it's under section 5F and G in the criteria. It's very minimal, and so that experience log is signed by a supervisor who is certifying that experience has been completed in compliance with USPAP. So whatever you do in above that minimum level is up to the state, but we are emphasizing what is the minimum.
Mark, I think this would be a good time to just read a comment to you and to have you comment about how the exam is designed. And here's the comment that somebody has made. I don't believe that the ability to memorize facts for an exam proves that they have the competency to do that, or that they can do it effectively or correctly. So do you want to talk about how the exam is not really designed around fact memorization?
Yes, I've been intimately involved with the exam since the beginning of the exam. And that exam is a practice-based exam. It's not facts and figures. There is a section of the exam that will require you to know terminology and this, that, and the other, but the The emphasis is the application of those concepts. So while you may know what let's say, for example, excess and land and surplus land may be, but can you apply that? And that's what the focus of the exam is. And that's where the marriage of education and experience comes together. So you've got to be able to apply that. And so therein lies one of the foundational reasons of why we have the sequential process of complete education and experience, and then go sit for your exam.
Thank you. And here's a question that is going to challenge both of us, Mark. It's a great question, so we may have to just take it back to the AQB, but I'm going to read it. What if the applicant is upgrading to CR or CG and does not have a supervisor? In other words, whoops, my chat box just went up. Where'd it go? In other words, the applicant has been able to gain the additional experience hours without a supervisor. Now that log is an attestation of experience.
Ooh, that's a
I
really
know.
good question.
I see, that's a good one.
And I will respectfully delay the answer for that and take that one back to my board. And I just want to make sure. I think I've got a good answer for it, but I don't want to step too far out on the limb. I want to make sure I've got the full board opinion on that before I open my mouth. So we will get back with you on that one.
Great, thank you. Ada, you want to take one of your hands that you have raised there, and then I'll go back to the chat box questions.
Yep, sounds good. So I have first hand was Laurie Noble. Laurie, I have just sent you a request. You should be able to speak.
Oh, thank you, Aida. Thank you all. Great meeting so far. I just wanted to chime in that this is really important, to small businesses, and that small businesses need predictability in our rules, when we're planning and working. And it's the unpredictability of these conditions that are making it really difficult for small businesses to succeed and grow our ranks at the same time. So, in an era of diversity and inclusion, I believe that it's time to, kind of step away from subjective decisions and follow the rules. And what we've discovered here is that the state agency isn't necessarily making those rulemaking processes responsibly. And those are the things that states need to take a look at so that small businesses can thrive and not have unpredictable rules that we have to follow. And that's what I wanted to express today.
Well, thank you, Laurie. Just to maybe tag on just a little bit, AQB has made it a focus over the last few years to try to pull down any unnecessary impediments for moving folks through the process. So those barriers to entry that are unnecessary, we're trying to emphasize the point that we need to kind of remove those. The system needs to work efficiently to move folks through to their license or certification, and having any kind of arbitrary or arbitrary, I guess the best way to put it, rules that make it very subjective of who you allow through the system is to me a dangerous place to be. That it needs to be very consistently applied, and that's why the rules are there.
Okay, here's one, Mark. Can a jurisdiction, can they require somebody who has passed the national exam, can they require that person to now create or have new experience after the exam?
Well, again, this is the purpose of the interpretation. is the process. If a jurisdiction is going to require or looks at the information that the applicant has turned in, and they determine that that experience is not sufficient to meet the criteria, then they need to be requiring that additional experience prior to allowing that person to sit for the exam. If you kind of put yourself in the position of the applicant who gets the permission slip from the jurisdiction that says you're cleared to go take your exam, and you go and you take the exam, you pass the exam, and then you go out with all your friends and you celebrate, and then you get the letter back from the state or the phone call that says, hey, we need 10 more examples of your experience, or you need an experience in a different type of valuation assignment, before we will actually issue your license or certification. It's a very distressing kind of situation to the applicant. So again, this is a sequential process. Education and experience needs to be completed and verified prior to examination.
Mark, I've got several comments in here about policy statement 4, which is, I believe it's outside the scope of the AQB and the criteria. Do you have any comments you want to make about what about policy statement 4 and how we can or cannot impact that?
Yeah, I understand. Policy statement 4 is from the appraisal subcommittee. It's not was not generated by AQB. This is ASC policy, and AQB is not in the position of ASC policy. But again, we do issue the minimum rules, and here's the minimum rules. It's that education and experience needs to be completed prior to examination, and where there is maybe some inconsistency between the rules and the policies, that's a little beyond what I can repair. But I do want to make jurisdictions aware that this is the minimum.
And just to clarify, Mark, I've got a couple comments in here about how, again, people can determine if a state is or is not out of compliance. And I think, just to reiterate what you said, that we really can't do that here. That's not the role that we would play. I don't know if you have any further comments you wanted to make on that or not.
Yeah, the system is set up, and I'll say it again, and I don't know how to say this any differently to make it clear, but AQB's responsibility under Title 11 is to issue the minimum rules. And this is the minimum that the states have to abide by. They can exceed the rules, but they can't go do less than the rules. ASC, and under their Title 11 responsibility, is in the enforcement. And so they're the ones that would come in and enforce the minimum rules. But the rulemaking is at the AQB level.
Perfect. That's all we have. I don't have any other hands raised, and all the questions have been asked. People have asked, is there a way to email and ask questions or give comments? And of course, you can always send me an email, lisad@appraisalfoundation.org. That's probably the fastest way to accomplish that. But if you just want to give us comments, you just go into the exposure draft before August 20th and click on any of those links and fill in however you want, or you can just, again, just send me an email directly. The board will also accept verbal comments at its virtual public meeting on August 24th. You should see your registration link in the chat box, and you can always check out our events page and register for upcoming meetings and webinars. Mark, do you have any last words before we sign off?
Sure. The only thing I would say is that the comment period is open. Submit those comments. This is a first exposure draft. And so we will certainly be taking all comments, taking those back to our full board. We'll discuss them individually, every comment. And so those comments are appreciated.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Please be sure and hopefully fill out our survey that pops up at the very end. It just takes a quick minute. And thank you for being with us. Send us any questions or any comments. Hope to hear from you. Have a good day.
Bye, y'all. Be safe.